Hi guys, it's a bit cooler today, so my dogs have been exercised this morning and they're both laying down having a little bit of a kip at the moment. So I thought it might be a good time to come on and have a little chat with you guys again. And what we're going to talk about today really is something that I think I need to explain, possibly because there are some misconceptions about the methods of training that I use, or possibly some people are deliberately misleading other people as to how I train, and therefore censoring me from certain groups. So I just really want to explain, first of all, that the methods that I use for dog training. And when I talk about dog training, I think at the very beginning of this, I need to just clarify what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the teaching of new behaviours. I'm not talking about stopping unwanted behaviours or what we would commonly know as behavioural work, okay? So as far as teaching new behaviours is concerned, I'm very, very, very much a reward-based trainer. And I'm pretty sure most of you will understand what that means. Quite simply, it means that I ask the dog to be a willing participant in training because there is something that they will find rewarding in it for them. Now that reward can be possibly food, it could be a game or play, it could be physical touch and affection, it could actually be access to something that they want in the environment. Okay, so something that they find rewarding is what I'm going to tap into really. But generally speaking, to begin with at least, that tends to be food or play, a game, a toy. I tend to do this through lure reward training. And I think most of us nowadays know exactly what that is. Most of us have taught our dogs how to sit through simple lure reward training, rather than pushing their bum down like we used to maybe in the old days, okay? I'm a really big advocate for marker training, and both lure reward training and marker training form an integral part, in actual fact, a fundamental building block in that communication system that I mentioned in a previous video. So they're very, very important that I start with these things early on in the dog's development and when I start training the dog. Now, I don't tend to use a clicker for marking correct behaviour. I tend to prefer to use my voice. There's several reasons for that. It allows me to have various markers for various things and to mean various things to the dog. And more importantly, I think for most clients that I'm working with, most owners, they find the use of the voice natural to them, okay? And the clicker is just something else that they've got to master in effect, and they've got a lot to learn, as I spoke about, with the sort of loose lead walking aspect of things. Anyway, so I tend to use verbal markers. Those are based on human language. I will tend to have a marker that means yes, and that is actually the marker I use. What you've just done is exactly what I wanted you to do, and I'm going to pay you very well for it. Thank you very much. I will tend to have what I class as, and what most people class as, a continuation marker, which means that yes, what you're doing, and I have to be careful not to use the word yes, but what you're doing is exactly the right thing. It's correct. It's what I wanted. But I just need you to continue doing that. And I might use this for, let's say, a duration exercise like a downstay or something like that, or even actually walking nicely next to me to heel. I will have a mistake marker, and I will tend to, again, in the early stages, introduce the mistake marker. And let me just explain very briefly what that is. So if I ask the dog to sit and the dog offers me the wrong behaviour, it might go into a down instead, I will just want to communicate to the dog that I appreciate the fact that you've offered me a behaviour, but it's actually not the behaviour I really wanted at this time, and I want to give you an opportunity to possibly perform the correct behaviour. So I'll have a mistake marker, okay? I'll also have a marker that says, no, you really can't do that. That's very dangerous. or it's socially unacceptable, or it's personally unacceptable to me. It may possibly get us into hot water with authorities and stuff like that. And it's just really, you really shouldn't be doing that. And I'll have a marker for that, okay? And if I can condition those markers using science, okay, I'm not really going to mention what the science is. Let's just say that the science is association and consequences, okay? And you probably know what the science is anyway. Okay, but I'm just trying to speak in layman's terms, really, rather than keep using labels for stuff. It's much easier for people to understand. So if I can condition those markers really, really well, then the dog responds actually to the marker. It's actually, performing for the marker, if you like, or not performing because it's hurt the marker. So as far as how do I teach new behaviours? Lure rewarding, marker training, and if I can also condition the marker, what the marker enables me to do is actually capture natural behaviours that the dog performs sometimes on its own without me asking for it. And what I can do is I can actually mark that behaviour, even though I don't want it at the moment, and I can tell you, you know what, I like that. And if we actually can get to perform that behaviour on an instruction later on somewhere, that can be rewarding for you, okay, which is basically capturing that moment that the dog gives us a natural behaviour. And marker training allows us to do that. So we can see that also through lure reward training, that gets the dog following my movement, possibly the movement of the hand that's got the treat in or the toy in, or possibly my own personal movement. If I'm holding that treat still, but I'm moving, I'm physically moving with it, okay? And all those perform, as I said, or actually form part of that really important communication system. So it's just not all verbal. Now, one thing I would like to say is that this is quite easy to do. So most people I've come across can do this. Not everybody. I've mentioned before that if we've got a little dog and we're trying to lure that dog with food to walk nicely beside us, we might struggle with that. But most dogs can be lured into a basic sit position or a down position. And more importantly, a lot of dogs can be lured into the hill position. And if we teach the dog, and we teach the dog through luring to come into the heel position, or that place next to us where we really want them to walk nicely, okay, and we can actually build value in that position. So in other words, the dog can start to associate and anticipate that being in that position is very good for them, and they actually get paid very well, okay, for taking that position naturally. Yeah, so we can actually use this to our advantage to actually teach the dog to take that position, and that then leads us into our loose lead walking. Now, what I would say is that we don't just rely on learning through association and learning through the consequences or the past history of behaviours either being rewarding or not being rewarding or being possibly unpleasant when we're teaching our dogs. But that takes us into a slightly different conversation, and I really don't want to get too much into that at the moment. But I think it's important to remember that nowadays we literally don't just rely on those two pieces of basic science, if you like, okay? We do take into account nowadays the dog's emotions, the genetic makeup of the dog, the innate needs of the dog. Excuse me, I'm just trying to formulate my thoughts. And we also look at the brain function of the dog much, much more. We try to understand it. And what we have to realise is that none of these things are actually working in isolation. Yeah, they are actually all the time that the dog is in effect conscious and its central nervous system, if you like, is operating, that all these things are applicable and are having an effect on our dogs. Okay. But when it comes to teaching basic behaviours, we really just separate a couple, that those ones that we find easiest to use or employ to get the dog to do what we want it to do on verbal instruction. Okay, so I'm a reward-based trainer. Don't listen to those people that will possibly lead you to believe otherwise. All right. I will speak to you a little bit later on about how we actually stop unwanted behaviours and why then we might have to take a slightly different approach. Okay? But it's very, very important to even remember that even when it comes to that, we need to still be able to effectively be able to communicate with our dogs. But more importantly, we have to be able to effectively be able to teach our dogs what we want it to do instead, possibly, of the unwanted behaviours. Okay? So we take a slightly different track, but we also find that everything is interlinked. Yeah, and to try and separate them, we really do ourselves a disservice. Okay, we can't look at things separately all the time. We also have to think about the part that we play much, much more, either when we're trying to teach new behaviours or when we're trying to possibly modify unwanted behaviours or change unwanted behaviours. And this comes down to that association thing that I mentioned earlier. You have to remember that because dogs learn through association, that we're part of that association. And that's why sometimes what dogs learn just through the consequences of their behaviour don't carry over when we switch handler. Okay, and now I'm sort of linking into my previous conversations, if you like. So, yes, I'm a reward-based trainer. Why do I like to use a reward-based method of teaching new behaviours? Because the dogs enjoy it, we can enjoy it. All of a sudden, and I've used this sort of analogy before, that we're dancing with a willing partner. However, there is a little bit of a drawback if we base our whole relationship with our dogs on this premise of how we actually teach wanted behaviours. And if we're not very careful, as I've mentioned previously, there's a little bit of a pitfall that we can fall into. And I'm not going to discuss that too much, but I am going to add possibly a little bit more to that if I can. And that is that we have to look at what healthy relationships should look like. Now, we can look at our own relationships with our partners, our family, our friends, our work colleagues, anybody that we come in contact with. And I'm sure that we can all agree that sometimes those relationships that are purely built on there being something in it for either ourselves or the other person, the other party, which includes our dogs. Those relationships that are only built on there being something in it for either party are quite often not that healthy. It doesn't take much for that relationship to become skewed, if you like. And I think this is a pitfall that people fall into if they only ever base their relationship with their dogs on a reward-based system. That there is always something in it for the dog. I personally don't believe that is a healthy relationship, and quite often when I'm having to work with clients that have got behavioural issues, what I find is that their relationship is quite often built on that premise. I just want to leave you with that thought for now. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to sign off and say goodbye. Thank you very much for listening, and I will speak to you again soon. Bye bye for now.